On September 21, 1972, the Philippines democracy was still functioning. Senator Benigno S. Aquino Jr. was still able to make a privileged speech in the Senate, which would be his final one. So those were the last days of democracy because 2 days after that, the martial law was declared and implemented. Concerned Christians for civil liberties organized a protest march in Plaza Miranda that afternoon. So it is a mass rally organized by a certain organization and was held at Plaza Miranda in Quiapo. Newspapers were still published on September 22, 1972, a day after Ninoy Aquino's final speech. So they featured the gathering held the day before in Plaza Miranda. So according to Mijares, Marcos was angered by a Daily Express article that if martial law was implemented, Aquino indicated he would have to be jailed soon after or flee to join the rebellion. Proclamation of martial law. So on September 21, 1972, the martial law was declared by the former President Ferdinand E. Marcos under Proclamation 1081. According to Marcos, martial law was a strategic way to defend the Constitution legally and safeguard the welfare of the Filipino people from the grave dangers posed by Christian vigilance and Muslim rebel groups, both of which pose a threat to the country's security. So the purpose of the emergency rule, according to Marcos, was to lead the country into what he refers to as a new society. So this new society that he was referring is that he was trying to build a new reformed society that will change the nation's social, political, economic, and cultural life. Ferdinand Marcos appeared on television at 7:15 p.m. on September 23, 1972 to announce that he had placed the entire Philippines under martial law by virtue of Proclamation number 1081, and he announced that he had placed the entire country under martial law as of 9 p.m. on September 22, 1972 via a proclamation which he claimed he'd signed on September 21, 1972. So this means that the martial law was signed on September 21, 1972, and that information was disseminated on the public 2 days after that. Culmination of a long period of preparation. A week before the actual declaration of martial law, a number of people had already received information that Marcos had drawn up a plan to completely take over the government and gain absolute rule. Senator Benigno S. Aquino Jr., during a September 13, 1972 privilege speech, exposed what was known as a Plan Sagittarius. He had received a top-secret military plan given by Marcos himself to place Metro Manila and outlying areas under the control of the Philippine Constabulary as a prelude to martial law. Marcos also informed the military that he would proceed with proclaiming martial law even if the U.S. Embassy in Manila knew as early as September 17, 1972 about Marcos' plan. The Enrile ambush as pretext for martial law. Marcos was able to impose martial law as a result of the purported attempt on the life of Juan Ponce Enrile, the country's defense secretary at the time. Based from his diary, Secretary Juan Ponce was ambushed near Wakwak at about 8 p.m. tonight. It was a good thing he was riding in his security car as a protective measure. This makes the martial law proclamation a necessity. Because of the attempted murder on Juan Ponce Enrile, Marcos thought that the martial law proclamation was necessary in order to safeguard the lives of the Filipino people. Based from the account of Oscar Lopez, he heard a lot of shooting and that when he went out to see what was happening, he saw an empty car riddled with bullets. Lopez's driver, who happened to see the incident, narrated that there was a car that came and stopped beside the Meralco post. Some people got out of the car and then there was another car that came by beside it and started riddling it with bullets to make it look like it was ambushed. According to Primitivo Mijares, a former journalist for Marcos, who would later write against Marcos and disappear without a trace in 1973, that the Enrile ambush was fake as it was made as the final excuse for Marcos to declare martial law. And Secretary Enrile later revealed in 1986 that the ambush was staged by Marcos to justify martial law. So basically, the ambush was just an act in order to implement the martial law.
Marcos used several events to justify martial law. The alleged attempt on the life of the Secretary of Defense Juan Ponce Enrile gave Marcos a window to declare martial law. Marcos announced the emergency rule the day after the shooting incident, and that was the time that the declaration was initially supported by most Filipinos and was viewed by some critics as a change that solved the massive corruption in the country. Martial law put an end to the conflict between the executive and legislative arms of the government, as well as a biased bureaucracy. The purpose of the emergency rule in Marcos' vision was to lead the country into what he refers to as a new society. Marcos started to implement reforms in social and political values that hindered effective modernization. His reforms targeted his rivals within the elite, depriving them of their power and patronage, but did not affect their supporters. Gerardo Sicat, the head of the National Economic Development Authority, outlined the new society's first three priorities as peace and order, land reform, and economic development. On the other hand, Executive Secretary Alejandro Melchor emphasized that the ultimate objective of the new society is the promotion of social justice and equality for all Filipinos. During the full implementation of martial law, under the Marcos regime, the army and the Philippine Constabulary seized weapons and disbanded private armies controlled by prominent politicians and other influential figures. Marcos took control of the legislature and closed the Philippine Congress. And also, Marcos allegedly funneled huge amounts of money from the country's finances by allowing some of his loyal friends and relatives in crucial business positions to acquire great wealth and economic influence through special government favors and privileges. The experts refer to this as crony capitalism. Marcos' accomplishments. The legal justification asserted for the declaration of martial law was the existence of an armed rebellion led by the Maoist New People's Army. To combat this rebellion, many thousands of civilians were detained for suspicion of complicity or sympathy. About 5,000 of them remained under detention in 1976 and hundreds were tortured. 30,000 opposition figures, including Senator Benigno Aquino, journalists, students, and labor activists have been detained at military facilities under the command of the president. At the same time, the military launched campaigns in several provinces against the rebels. Non-political crimes of violence were also reduced, partly as a result of the massive roundup of private firearms. Bolstering legitimacy. The efforts of President Marcos to maintain the stability of his regime may be divided into two general categories. First, his attempts to bolster regime legitimacy in the eyes of the whole populace, or the strategy. And second, his moves to reduce the threat from particular sources, or the tactics. Efforts at legitimation included a vigorous economic development policy, the success of which depended on the vagaries of international commodity prices and on attracting foreign loans and investment, and the institution of referenda through barangays. Media control. Media control has been one of the key elements in the fostering of legitimacy in the public mind. In fact, a measure of the priority is the amount of time the president gives personally to directing media tactics. Media control is essentially for maintaining two important myths about the new society. First is that the crime has practically been eliminated, and second, that corruption is rare or in any case, always punished. During the time, several institutions and media outlets have been closed, which caused the public to become less conscious, and public awareness of crime has certainly declined. Crime is rarely reported, and when theft or murder does receive notice in the newspapers, the Metropolitan Police are always described as getting their man. Moreover, official corruption is seldom mentioned, and only when someone has been formally charged or dismissed from office. Though corrupt practices did indeed diminish sharply in the first several months after the declaration of martial law, when fear of the consequences of misdeeds was still high, old ways quickly returned.
Categories of acquiescence and legitimacy. Acquiescence, referring to acceptance or submission both behaviorally and verbally to authority because it has a monopoly of force. Legitimacy, defined as the acceptance of authority as legal or morally rightful. Of those who did cast a ballot mentioned in the order of their support for the regime are also differentiated in different groups. Regime participants, those who are so involved in the present political and economic order and reaping so much benefit from it that they are willing supporters of constituted authority and its claims to legitimacy. Unsophisticated subjects, those who have a fatalistic bahala na outlook on politics. Sophisticated subjects, they find sufficient economic benefit under the present regime to accept it. However, they are somewhat familiar with constitutional processes and the magnitude of high-level corruption and thus do not believe that the regime rules by legal or moral right. The last groups are the opposition participants, those who refuse to grant legitimacy to the regime and do not even agree verbally, though they stop short of any act of resistance. Dealing with the military, Marcos rightfully fears the military most. Though before 1972 the Philippine Armed Force had been as dependent on the elected politicians as had the civilian administration, the very existence of the martial law regime now requires the continued support of the military. One of the president's first moves after the declaration of martial law was to increase the base pay of all commissioned officers by 150%, as military satisfaction is most fundamentally assured by providing the armed force with a generous budget. The U.S. role. American military aid is partly responsible for the prolongation of the war in the South, which is the war going on in Mindanao and Sulu, and it engaged about half of the entire army. To the degree to which Marcos needs to cut civilian programs in order to finance the military, he is also relieved of the pressure to bring the conflict to a political solution. U.S. arms aid of all types to the Philippines was about 100% higher in the 3 years after the declaration of martial law than in the comparable period before. Economy during martial law. A remarkable real growth rate of 10% was achieved in 1973, but by 1975, the world market price for almost all major export had dropped dramatically. A ban on strike was imposed and there was inflation happened. The Philippine foreign debt rose from 1.7 billion pesos in 1972 to 6.3 billion pesos in 1975, which led to an economic slump. The accomplishments in the realm of social justice have been less noticeable than in general economic development, and in fact, the richer continue to get richer and the poor get poorer. End of martial law. The deterioration of the political and economic conditions in the Philippines triggered the decline of support for Marcos' plans. More and more Filipinos took up arms to overthrow the regime. Urban poor communities in the country's capital were organized by the Philippine Ecumenical Council for Community and soon held protests and prayer rallies. These efforts, which included the disclosure of several human rights crimes, compelled Marcos to hold elections in 1978 and 1981 in order to calm the country's chaotic situation. In both times, Marcos was elected president of the Philippines, but his prolonged administration provoked a fierce backlash against his government. Martial law officially ended on January 17, 1981, while Marcos remained in office until the historic EDSA People Power Revolution in 1986. Following the murder of former Senator Benigno Aquino, social anger peaked. Numerous Filipinos took to the streets after the tragedy to demand Marcos' resignation. Returning to his electoral strategy, Marcos called a snap election in 1986, but he failed to appease the general public, who became even more determined to overthrow him. Corazon Aquino, the widow of Benigno Aquino, was elected president of the Philippines, forcing Marcos out of Malacanang Palace and bringing an end to his 21 years of tyrannical rule.
Next is the chronic capitalism blamed for economic crisis. Nepotism is a form of favoritism shown to acquaintances and family members. Nepotism is the act of abusing one's power or official position to offer a job or a favor to a family member while disregarding their merit and qualification. And the most common form of nepotism is increasing employment opportunities for relatives, although there are arguments for nepotism practices when it comes to small family-run businesses, and most studies show that nepotism can cause decreased morale and commitment from employees that are not related to their employers. Crony capitalism, or sometimes called cronyism, is an economic system in which businesses thrive through collusion between business interests and the ruling politicians. It is a system that has allowed certain friends and relatives of the president or family to acquire great wealth and economic power through special favors and privileges extended by the government. The favoritism has continued to benefit some cronies through government bailouts even after their firms went belly up. Crony capitalism lingered beyond the Marcos era. So during the interview of Imelda Marcos, the wife of the Philippine president, was asked by an interview in 1979 on how it was that many of their relatives and friends had become so rich, she replied that it was all in the nature of things and some of them were smart than others. And because of the remarks stated by the president's wife, more than 100 companies owned by friends of the Marcos family have failed, and many of these firms were taken over the state when they were unable to repay loans guaranteed by the government. The failures of the companies reflect the weakness and excess of what the Philippine businessmen have dubbed crony capitalism, a system that many feel is largely responsible for the country's current economic mess. And why is it that this crony capitalism was responsible for the country's current mess? Crony capitalism during the Marcos era involved big issues like Huangco's control coconut industry monopoly. The industry provides the livelihood of about a third of the population and ranks as the leading foreign exchange earner, bringing in about $1 billion a year. A year after Marcos declared martial law, he began issuing a series of decrees to rationalize the coconut industry, in effect creating a monopoly that was delegated to Huangco, critics have charged. Perhaps the most controversial aspects of Marcos' coconut industry organization was the imposition of a levy on coconut farmers that generated about $142 million per year. According to the industry sources, the funds were deposited to Huangco's United Coconut Planters Bank interest-free. But when coconut planters went to the bank to get financing from the replanting fund, they were obliged to pay 8% to 10% interest for borrowing back their own money. Next is the sugar trading monopoly. Benedicto took charge of the sugar industry after Marcos created a monopoly in that major sector in 1974 through a series of presidential decrees, according to the University Economic Report. And according to that report, the sugar monopoly has resulted in losses to producers of $1.2 billion to $1.5 billion from 1974 to 1983. Sugar planters have complained bitterly in demonstrations and public statements that the Sugar Trading Corporation has failed to account for about $150 million in revenue from September 1979 to June 1984 and has not paid many planters for purchases. It was predicted that it would collapse because they had no money to finance their planting and refining operations. Benedicto pressured the planters to sign a 5-year contract with this trading corporation. People of Negros got angry and have protested Benedicto's policy regarding the trading corporation, and Marcos has also said that he would reorganize it and declare the sugar industry's problems solved. Next is the cigarette filter business monopoly. This business, which first to fall to Herminio Di Sini, Marcos issued a presidential decree in 1975 by raising import tariffs for his foreign-owned competitors to 100% to 10%. When the commission was publicized in 1978, Marcos ordered an investigation and divested Di Sini for 3 companies. However, critics charged that the 3 firms were the least profitable of his growing empire, but Marcos promptly stepped in and ordered it to take over 13 of Di Sini's largest companies and assume their obligations. Now, most of the companies Di Sini once owned have been taken over by the government, sold, or liquidated. And the last is the other government insurance brokerage monopoly and industrial companies, like the electrical company Meralco, which taken over the Lopez's with a large shareholding, Times Journal, a major bank, and a large investment management company.
Good day, everyone. So I am now going to discuss what happened during the EDSA 1. EDSA 1, also known as the People's Power Revolution, that took place from 1983. So what happened during EDSA 1 was there were a series of popular demonstrations in the Philippines that began in 1983 and culminated in 1986. It was also referred as the Yellow Revolution due to the presence of yellow ribbons during the demonstrations as a symbol of protest following the assassination of Filipino Senator Benigno Ninoy Aquino Jr. So it was called EDSA 1 because EDSA 1 took place in the street of Epifanio de los Santos Avenue. Now, why did it happen? What were the reasons why the people protested in the street of EDSA? So here are some reasons for it. So first one is the assassination of Ninoy Aquino Jr. Also because of the martial law that President Marcos declared. One of the reasons also is because of the electoral fraud. And lastly, because of the message aired by Cardinal Sin. The death of Benigno Aquino Jr. So the assassination of Benigno Aquino Jr. took place on Sunday, August 21, 1983 at Manila International Airport. So Aquino was a longtime political opponent of President Ferdinand Marcos. So he just landed in the Philippines, but then he got shot in the head while being escorted from an aircraft to a vehicle that was waiting to transport him to prison. So, snap elections. So, in the Philippines, the term snap election usually refers to the 1986 presidential election, where Ferdinand Marcos called elections earlier than scheduled in response to growing social unrest. So in here, Marcos was declared official winner of the election, but was ousted by the thought that he cheated on the elections. So in year 1983, this was the time where the EDSA 1 or the People's Power Revolution started. So there is a timeline on what happened during this year. So in August 21, it was the time where Ninoy Aquino was assassinated. In September 21, Ninoy supporters held a National Day of Sorrow while the government celebrates National Thanksgiving Day to commemorate the declarations of martial law. For the year 1984, on May 14, the elections for Batasang Pambansa are held, and with Cory Aquino's support to the opposing candidates, they surprised Marcos by winning 56 seats out of 183 amid familiar allegations of fraud. And in October 24, the Agrawal Board tasked with investigating the Aquino assassination concludes that there was a military conspiracy behind the killing and implicates AFP Chief of Staff Fabian Ver. So for the year 1985, it was August where opposition MPs filed a motion for impeachment against Marcos in Batasan, citing culpable violation of the Constitution and hidden wealth. The majority party squelches the motion. On November 3, Marcos suddenly announces the holding of snap elections after alleged flooding from the United States. And December 3, Corazon Aquino declares her candidacy for president, and have Salvador Laurel, who earlier was wanted to run for the same position, agrees to be her running mate. Where in December 5, the opposition makes a formal announcement of the Aquino-Laurel tandem for the snap election. So for the last year of the EDSA won 1986. So February 7, this was the time where elections happened, but there were issues or incidents of fraud, vote buying, intimidation, and violence that were reported, and the elections returns are tampered with. So the Commissions on Elections Tally Board shows Marcos leading, while the National Citizens Movement for the Free Elections consistently shows that Cory Aquino was ahead by a comfortable margin. So on February 9, 30 computer workers at the Comelec Tabulation Center walked out protesting the tampering of elections result. So February 13, the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines issues a statement condemning the elections as fraudulent. This was headed by Cardinal Sin. And in February 22, Enrile and Ramos withdrew their support from the government and called upon the resignation of then President Marcos. This also the day where the people began to march the streets of EDSA to protest to the Malacanang. In February 25, this was the day where Corazon Aquino took the presidential oath of office and was proclaimed as the first lady who became president in the Philippines and the 11th president of the Philippines. So in this day, people rejoiced to the success of the EDSA, the People's Power Revolution, as they were fighting for the Philippines, for the country's democracy.